So friends, we've just had 3 legal developments that I think can accurately be characterized as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, these days, trying to keep up with all of the legal developments, not to mention the illegal developments by Trump and company, it's a lot like trying to drink from a fire hose. But let's take on 3 new stories, and yes, we can call them the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm going to start with the good, and then I'm going to jump forward to the ugly, and then we will come back and finish up with the bad. But let's start with the good. This from CBS News. Headline, Judge blocks Trump from cutting off Planned Parenthood funding under Big Beautiful Bill. Let me fix that, the Big Ugly Democracy Busting Bill. And that article begins, a judge on Monday temporarily blocked the Trump administration from revoking Medicare funding for Planned Parenthood, partially freezing a provision of the One Big Ugly Democracy Busting Bill Act just days after Trump signed it into law. The temporary restraining order by U.S. District Judge Indira Talwani lasts 14 days and directs the Department of Health and Human Services to take all steps necessary to ensure that Medicaid funding continues to be dispersed to Planned Parenthood. The ruling, which came after a lawsuit from Planned Parenthood, doesn't apply to any other health care providers. The lawsuit takes aim at a portion of Mr. Trump's signature domestic policy bill that would cut off any federal Medicaid funding to groups primarily engaged in family planning services, reproductive health, and related medical care that provide abortions. The provision doesn't directly mention Planned Parenthood by name, but the group argues it's a naked attempt to leverage the government's spending power to attack and penalize Planned Parenthood and impermissibly single it out for unfavorable treatment. Federal Medicaid dollars already cannot be used to cover abortions except in cases of rape, incest, or risk to a mother's life. But Planned Parenthood argues this new provision would make it harder for patients to access the non-abortion services offered by the group's local members, like screenings for cancer and sexually transmitted infections. Planned Parenthood also said more than half of its patients use Medicaid, so a funding cutoff would have devastating effects on the group and its local affiliates, forcing some local health centers to close. So friends, that's a self-explanatory good news story. Putting a temporary stop to the government's efforts, the efforts of the Trump administration, to punish Planned Parenthood by cutting off Medicaid funding, basically, just violating the equal protection of the laws. The second story is ugly, but it's ugly in kind of a delicious way, because it looks like a federal court judge caught the Trump administration in a lie, called them out on that lie, and is demanding answers. So let me set this one up. Several of the Venezuelan immigrants who were unlawfully and unconstitutionally deported to that prison in El Salvador brought legal challenges, brought lawsuits. And remember how the Trump administration is forever saying, well, we can't possibly bring those Venezuelans back from that prison in El Salvador. Remember, Attorney General Bondi said that's impossible. They are now in the exclusive custody and control of another country, a sovereign nation. We don't have the ability or the authority to bring them back. Well, guess what? It looks like El Salvador begs to differ. And here is a letter that was just released that was written by one of the federal judges presiding over one of the cases brought by some of these Venezuelan immigrants who were unlawfully deported to El Salvador. This is from Judge Stephanie Gallagher. And I'm going to read this letter. It's a little dense. And then when I'm done, I'm going to try to translate it from legalese to English. So this comes from the United States District Court for the District of Maryland, and it's dated July 8th, 2025, in the case of J.O.P. et al. And others versus U.S. Department of Homeland Security et al. And others. That's one of the lawsuits brought by one of the Venezuelan men. Dear counsel, this court takes judicial notice of a report on enforced or involuntary disappearances from the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which was filed by the petitioners, the plaintiffs in this particular case. In the UN report, the government of El Salvador responded to the UN's inquiry opened by 4 families asking about the disappearance of their family members, each of whom are Venezuelan nationals allegedly deported from the United States to El Salvador as part of the mass deportations that have taken place since March 15, 2025. In its response to the UN, the government of El Salvador states, "The actions of the state of El Salvador have been limited to the implementation of a bilateral cooperation mechanism with another state through which it has facilitated the use of the Salvadoran prison infrastructure for the custody of persons detained within the scope of the justice system and law enforcement of that other state." Spoiler alert, that other state is us, the United States. My editorial edition. In this context, the jurisdiction and legal responsibility for these persons lie exclusively with the competent foreign authorities by virtue of international agreements signed and in accordance with the principles of sovereignty and international cooperation in criminal matters. Now, back to what the judge wrote to the Department of Justice and the attorneys in the case. In status reports submitted pursuant to this court's June 5, 2025 order, defendants, that would be Trump and Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, defendants have repeatedly skirted this court's directive to provide information regarding the steps they have taken and will take to facilitate the return of Christian, one of the Venezuelan men unlawfully deported to El Salvador, to facilitate the return of Christian to the United States. Instead, defendants have repeatedly made oblique references to their request of assistance from the U.S. Department of State, DOS, which has entered into negotiations to facilitate Christian's return and assumed responsibility on behalf of the U.S. government for diplomatic discussions with El Salvador. In other words, a bunch of double-speak nonsense by which the Trump administration continues to skirt the court's rulings and orders. Yes, again, my editorial edition. Assuming the government of El Salvador provided truthful information to the United Nations, no diplomatic discussions should be required here because El Salvador has no sovereign interest in Christians' continued confinement in that country. This court directs defendants, the Trump administration, the Department of Justice, to explain their position that diplomatic discussions involving the Department of State are required to facilitate Christians' return to the United States in compliance with this court's order. Defendants should provide their response no later than Tuesday, July 15, 2025. Despite the informal nature of this letter, it is an order of the court and should be docketed accordingly. Sincerely yours, Stephanie A. Gallagher, United States District Judge. Now, friends, you probably don't need me to translate that from legalese to English, but can I do it anyway? Basically, Judge Gallagher is telling Trump and the Department of Justice, yeah, I caught you in a lie. You were directed to facilitate the return of this Venezuelan Christian to the United States, and you gave me nothing but, double speak and misdirection about, negotiations, and we need to engage in diplomatic discussions using the Department of State to, talk with El Salvador. Oh, bullshit. El Salvador just formally told the United Nations they ain't our prisoners. We're only keeping them in our prison in El Salvador for the United States. They brought them here. They told us to confine them. They're paying us to do so, but they ain't our prisoners. So Judge Gallagher basically told Trump and the Department of Justice, enough with the bullshit about, sensitive diplomatic negotiations. And she ordered Trump administration officials to explain themselves. All of this doublespeak and misdirection and nonsense they've been spewing out. So, that's ugly, but it's ugliness that is visiting the Trump administration and Pam Bondi's Department of Justice. Now, friends, the third story, which is bad, but I'm going to take a leap of faith and say it's not necessarily as bad as it seems at first blush. Let's start with a little bit of the new reporting, this from the New York Times. Supreme Court clears the way for mass firings at federal agencies. And that article begins, the Trump administration can move forward with plans to slash the federal workforce and dismantle federal agencies, the Supreme Court announced on Tuesday. The decision could result in job losses for tens of thousands of employees at agencies, including the Departments of Housing and Urban Development, State, and Treasury. The order, which lifted a lower court's ruling that had blocked mass layoffs, was unsigned and did not include a vote count, which is typical in such emergency applications. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote a public dissent. Now, friends, yes, I know, that sounds bad. That sounds ominous. But here's the thing. We're not there yet. This new Supreme Court ruling, the vote, was 8-1. 8 justices thought that this procedural ruling, it's not a substantive ruling saying Trump can fire all these people. It really was a procedural ruling, and 8 of the justices, yes, the 6 radical right-wing ideologue justices, but also Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan joined in this ruling. Only Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson filed a dissent. So I'm going to read a very little bit of this new Supreme Court ruling, and then I'm going to suggest that although it's bad, it's not as bad as it seems on the surface. So in the case of Donald Trump versus American Federation of Government Employees et al. And others, on application for stay. The application for stay presented to Justice Kagan and by her referred to the court is granted. The May 22nd, 2025 preliminary injunction entered by the United States District Court for the Northern District of California is stayed or paused pending the disposition of the appeal in the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. And friends, I want to jump right to the voice of reason. Justice Sotomayor, as she sets out in one short paragraph why she joined the majority opinion, why she believed procedurally at this stage the stay was appropriate. I agree with Justice Jackson that the president cannot restructure federal agencies in a manner inconsistent with congressional mandates. Here, however, the relevant executive order directs agencies to plan reorganizations and reductions in force consistent with applicable law. And the resulting joint memorandum from the Office of Management and Budget and Office of Personnel Management reiterates as much. The plans themselves are not before this court at this stage, and we thus have no occasion to consider whether they can and will be carried out consistent with the constraints of law. I join the court's stay because it leaves the district court free to consider those questions in the first instance. So friends, without doing a deep dive into the legal weeds, when there is an opinion like this that enjoys an 8-1 vote with Justices Sotomayor and Kagan joining the majority and believing this is the correct sort of procedural opinion to hand down at this very preliminary stage of this case, which is still going to be litigated in the lower courts, I take some comfort in believing that, this is not necessarily as bad as it seems. There may be plans being put together, but as Justice Sotomayor says, those plans must be, in accordance with applicable law. And the suggestion is if they're not, and, these issues are litigated in the lower courts, well, then judges are free to and should rule that what the Trump administration is trying to do is lawless. But at this point, it's preliminary. Plans are being put together, and they have to be litigated in the court below before, Trump gets to do all the damage he is dying to do, hurting the federal workforce and by extension, hurting the American people, because that's what Donald Trump is doing. That's everything that he's doing. So I am willing to accept the considered judgment of Justice Sotomayor and Justice Kagan, not so much the 6 radical right-wing ideologue justices, and conclude, at least at this stage, that this one is not as bad as it seems at first blush. So friends, that felt like a lot today, right? But we'll keep doing the best we can to bring you the legal news of the day, translate it from legalese to English, try to clear away all the lies, the disinformation, the propaganda, and really get at what's happening. Because justice matters. Friends, as always, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.